Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our virtual town hall. I am Arcelia Hurtado, and I am the Managing Attorney for Culture, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. And we're really looking forward to tonight's town hall with you. Chesa?
Well, thank you, Arcelia. It's great to be here with you. And of course, it's been a busy few weeks since the last time we did a town hall. Since then, we brought on a new chief of staff, David Campos. We're excited to have him in our leadership team. And we've also joined the Prosecutors Alliance led by Christine DeBerry, who was our former chief of staff. Like I said, it's been busy, and I'm really excited to be here with you, Arcelia, and with everyone in our community who's joined us and to answer as many questions as we have time for. So let's get started.
Great. Well, we received a lot of pre-submitted questions, so we're going to work our way through some of them first and then turn to chat questions and then mix it up a little bit. We won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but we will do our best. So let's get started. This question comes from Will in Russian Hill, and it's a similar question to others that came in. He writes that there have been multiple issues on his street, both of which have had poor police response, as the police claimed that the DA's office would not prosecute the case because it was nonviolent. Will wrote about 2 incidents, including a residential burglary in which his garage was broken into in the middle of the night and his home was cased. He said that the police did not take fingerprints when they arrived and that they told him that the DA had a policy of not prosecuting burglaries even if they found the suspect. Will also said that his neighbor up the street had video of the same suspect trying to break into their property and no prints were taken, nor was any attempt made to search for the suspect. And then more recently, a door was kicked in at the home of 3 single women on the same block. But again, nothing was done by the police. Will wants to know about the police's claim that the DA's office won't prosecute burglaries and why nothing was done by the police in these instances.
Thank you for the question, Will. I'm so sorry about your garage and the burglary that you experienced and for all of the crimes that you just described in your neighborhood. No one should live in fear that their home may be broken into and their valuables taken. That's unacceptable. I want to be very clear. My office does take burglaries seriously. And I'm really sorry that no suspect was identified by the police in your case, because had they been, we would have been in a position to prosecute that case. And I also want to be very clear, Will, I am disappointed and frankly, I'm angry that the police officers you spoke with made excuses and told you lies to avoid doing their job. It's unacceptable. So let's talk about facts. And I want to put this misinformation to bed because I'm sorry to say, I hear reports like yours, Will, almost every day. People who are told by police officers that the police simply won't do their job because they dislike me or the district attorney's office. Let's be very clear. Burglaries in San Francisco, as reported to the police department, have gone up by about 40% this year. And if you give me a minute, I'm going to show you the data that I'm looking at and that I'm drawing on for this. Give me a moment. Let me see if I can share my screen with all of you. Arcelia, are you able to see the crime dashboard?
Yes, DA.
Thank you. So what I'm looking at is all crime reported to San Francisco Police Department in the year 2020 up to last Sunday, as compared with the exact same period in the prior year. And so if you go over to the burglary section, you can see that it's up an absolutely unacceptable 44% year to date compared to last year. Now, many other categories of crime have gone down, as you can see, in terms of crime reported to the police department. Rape is down by about 51%. Robberies are down by over 22%. Thefts are down by nearly 40%. And crime overall is down by about 25%. Now, I want to be clear. We prosecute burglaries. We do not have any policy whatsoever of declining to prosecute burglaries or even other nonviolent crimes. And any claim by any police officer that we don't prosecute those cases is a bold-faced lie. And it's an excuse for their failure to do their job and investigate cases properly. Like take fingerprints, for example, as Will suggests in his question. Now, here are the facts. Let me see if I can unshare my screen. The fact is that we prosecute about 80% of the cases that police bring us. And in about 90% of the cases that police bring us, when we're talking about burglaries, whether we file new criminal charges or we take some other kind of action, like a probation violation or a referral to another jurisdiction, we take action in nearly 90% of residential burglaries where the police present us with a case, where they complete the investigation. And it's not just about fingerprints or video. If they complete their investigation and bring us a case, nearly 90% of the time, we take action. But here's the catch. We can only prosecute cases that the police investigate and solve, right? And this is the piece that I think is getting lost in a lot of these conversations. Despite the fact that burglaries have gone up, as we talked about, the police clearance rates for burglaries are abysmally and unacceptably low. Just 12% of burglaries reported to police this year have resulted in a case presented to my office. That means that in 88% of burglaries, like the one that Will experienced, the police never even bring my office a suspect to prosecute. They never present us with an investigation or a case. And this is according to the San Francisco Police Department's own data. These aren't our numbers. These have nothing to do with what we do down the line. Let me show you the other dashboard where the San Francisco Police Department publishes their own clearance rates. Give me a moment, I'll try to share the screen. So you can see that burglary clearance rates, again, comparing this year to last year, are down about 43%. Not only were clearance rates low last year, but they've fallen by almost exactly the same amount that burglaries have gone up. And we can't prosecute those cases that they don't solve. And if you look at an individual station, you can break it down by, I'm looking at individual stations here. You can look at, excuse me, let me go to the full dashboard. You can see burglary across the city, clearance rates are down by 25%. But if you go to individual districts, let's see, Bayview Station, burglaries are down by 36%. Clearance rates of burglaries are down by 36%. If you go to Northern Station, burglary clearance rates down by nearly 14%, right? So this is the police department's own data. This is them showing the public that despite their efforts, they are not solving these crimes. And I want to be very clear. We cannot prosecute a case when the police don't investigate and make an arrest. So the real question that we need to be asking ourselves about burglaries is why are so few cases being cleared by the police department? And why has that number gone down so much in the past 11 months? Now, I know that the work police do every day is difficult, is dangerous, is challenging. I'm not a police officer. I don't know how to personally go to a crime scene and collect fingerprints, for example. But I do know that if officers tell you they're not going to do their job, they're not going to bother to investigate the case, and then they're falsely blaming my office for their refusal to do their job, we have a very serious problem. And again, we take action in the vast majority of cases they bring us, but it doesn't make a dent when so few cases are solved. Now, this is a problem that we've had for months, and it's something that I've talked with Police Chief Scott about on a regular basis. Chief Scott and I have a really close working relationship, and I'm encouraging him to publicly denounce any claims by any of his staff, anyone under his command, that we do not prosecute burglaries. It's a lie. He knows it's a lie. We talk about it on a regular basis. And I hope that he will call on his staff to properly investigate every single report of crime. Thank you for your question, Will. And again, I'm so sorry for what you experienced and the way you were treated by the police department.
The next question is from Tammy. She also asked about home break-ins, which we've already discussed, but she also asked about whether someone must steal a minimum of $950 to qualify as a burglary in a home.
Tammy, thank you for your question. And I'm really glad you asked it because it's an area of confusion that I think we actually get a lot of questions about, this $950 limit. So I want to be really clear. Any entry into a home with the intent to commit a crime within the home can be and usually is prosecuted as a felony. In fact, the very first jury trial that we did in San Francisco after COVID hit was a residential burglary. It was charged and prosecuted by my office as a felony and as a strike, not because of the dollar value at issue in the theft, but because of the evidence that we believed showed the burglar had entered someone's home. We take entry into homes very seriously under state law and in our office. On the other hand, to the heart of your question, Tammy, for simple thefts that don't involve entry into the home, that only involve stealing property, then by California law, the value of that property must be over $950 in order for the crime to be classified as a felony. If it's below $950, then by law, it's a misdemeanor. It's still a crime. It's still regularly prosecuted by my office, but it is a less serious crime with less serious consequences for the person accused. And by law, many theft cases, again, not involving entry into the home, are eligible for diversion or some collaborative courts. It makes sense if you think about it. I mean, if we take people who are committing crimes, in some instances motivated by poverty or by addiction issues, and we give them a criminal conviction and jail time, when they're released, and we know this from decades of empirical data, they're actually more likely to commit future crimes, not less. But if instead we get at and treat the root causes of what drives them to criminal behavior, whether it be addiction or mental illness or housing, then our intervention and our effort to hold them accountable is far more likely to change behavior in the future. So there are lots of different kinds of theft motivated by different kinds of issues. And depending on the kind of theft, it may or may not have a dollar amount attached to it in terms of the felony misdemeanor divide. So to the heart of your question, Tammy, breaking into someone's home is a crime, is a felony, no matter the amount taken or not taken. There's no requirement that it be above $950. And I want to just take this opportunity as well to address a lot of questions I get on social media and by email about some of the big organized commercial burglaries from Walgreens and CVS that have really unfortunately been forcing some of those stores to close in parts of the city where they're needed. Most of those crimes tend to be felonies, not only because of the dollar amount, but because we can prove the intent going in, there's a conspiracy, there's other evidence that elevates it beyond a simple petty theft to something we can and do regularly prosecute as a felony. Thank you, Tammy.
DA, this is a follow-up question to the first question that you answered, and this is from Regina. In the residential burglary case where the police officer failed to take fingerprints and lied about the DA's role, what recourse does a citizen have against that police officer, and who disciplines that officer?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and you know, officer accountability and transparency around law enforcement is a really important issue in the country right now. It's something that my office has been doing a lot of work on. The kind of conduct that we're talking about, it's not criminal. It's not a crime for a police officer to refuse to do their job or to lie to citizens. It may be dereliction of duty, but it's not a crime. And so it's not my purview, it's not my mandate. I don't have the authority to discipline officers for engaging in that kind of misconduct. The chief of police or the police commission do. And the best thing for someone to do if you are dissatisfied with a police officer's handling of your case is to report it to the Department of Police Accountability. I'm going to see if I can put the link to their website in the chat for all attendees to see. Give me a moment. That is a link that allows you to go online and file a complaint documenting whatever your issue is with a particular police officer. And a separate agency outside the police department will then investigate and make a report that in appropriate cases leads to discipline through the police commission and the police chief.
Jenny asked a question about the recent victim survey that went out. She expressed concern about her fears of being a crime victim in the future and her worry for her and her family's public safety. She says that many residents believe this survey should be sent out to everyone across the city and believes there should be a place for comments too. She feels like the fact that the survey was not sent out to everyone suggests that you don't care about everyone.
Jenny, thank you for the question. I'm sorry that that's how it made you feel. I know we've been criticized by a lot of folks for the survey and how it was crafted. And so I appreciate you raising it and giving me the opportunity to respond. Let me first apologize to anybody who was offended by the survey or how it was conducted. I am sure that there is room for improvement in our outreach and in our efforts to get critical feedback. It's one of the reasons why we create as many platforms and vehicles as possible for folks to give us critical feedback. This is one of them. The survey was another one. Let me explain the intent of the survey. It was something designed by our victim services unit well before I took office. And it was intended to get feedback from crime victims and survivors about how their cases had been handled and how they felt about the process that they had been through. I totally agree with your criticism, Jenny, and it's one I've heard from other folks, that a comment section would have been helpful. And I appreciate the feedback. Everything we're doing is open to constructive, positive reforms and changes, and we need input to do a better job. That's exactly why we conducted the survey in the first place, because we wanted critical feedback. Now, the survey had more than 50 questions, and I wasn't involved in drafting them or writing them. But as many of you know, some of those questions focused on incarceration and traditional approaches to responding to crime. And others asked victims and survivors of crime how they felt about some of the reform ideas being talked about and even on the ballot next week at the state level. Things far beyond what we're doing in my office, things that necessarily are part of the criminal justice statewide conversation, because we wanted to get a sense of how the people that our office is serving view those policies that are being discussed at the state level. And we wanted to be able to improve the services that our really dedicated, hardworking staff in our victim services division provide to people who've been harmed by crimes. So, Jenny, we appreciate your critical feedback, and we want to hear from you, even if, thankfully, you haven't been a victim of a crime this year or ever. That is great if you haven't. We want to keep it that way. And we want your views about how our office can better serve every single person in San Francisco that I'm so proud and so humbled to serve in this capacity as district attorney. So it's why we do the town hall. It's why we're going to continue to do other forms of outreach. And folks should absolutely feel free to email me, reach out via social media. I or someone on our team will get back to you, and we look forward to your input and your constructive criticism. Thank you.
DA, this is a question from Julia. What are the plans for opening or reopening cases for individuals killed by law enforcement before you became DA? The community and the families of Luis Demetrio Gongora Pat, Alex Nieto, Mario Woods, Amilcar Perez Lopez, Jessica Williams, and so many others want to know.
Thank you for the question. These are cases that are really important to me, that were really important to San Francisco voters last year throughout the district attorney race. And they came up over and over and over again, because obviously there is a tremendous amount of damage and distrust and hurt that those shootings and killings caused. I committed during my campaign to take a close look at those cases and to reconsider whether it was possible to file and appropriate to file criminal charges in those cases. That is a commitment that I stand by. It is ongoing. And I will be the first to tell you that I am frustrated with how slow a process it has been. I could take a very long time in explaining all of the different obstacles that we face bureaucratically, institutionally, legally, in terms of resources, obstacles that have only been made worse by COVID. But let me say this. I committed to looking at those cases again and to having new staff, different attorneys, take a second look at those cases. And that process is ongoing. And I promise you will hear directly from me once we've been able to resolve that second look and close out our reviews and make a final decision about how we will handle those cases.
The next question is about the increase in homicides. Both Ellen and Lisa wrote in asking about an increase in shootings and the fear it causes them and their community. They also ask about whether and how you intend to prosecute homicide.
Every single homicide is tragic and irreparable. We cannot undo the harm that a homicide causes to our community and to the family of those who are killed. So I really just want to express my deepest sympathies to every single person who has lost a loved one in San Francisco due to a homicide. I want, as I think all of us do, for San Francisco to be a place where everyone feels safe and where no one has to lose a loved one to gun violence or to any other form of violence. Homicides and violent crimes are the category of crime that keep me up at night. They're the things that I most intensely prioritize in my prosecutions and in my allocation of resources within the office. Our homicide unit is where we have the lowest caseloads and the most experienced attorneys with the best support. It's how it has to be, and it's how it always will be under my watch. Now, it is true, as your question suggests, that homicides this year are significantly higher than they were last year. And I think it's really important when we talk about crime trends, and we did that a little earlier tonight, it's really important also to look at big picture context and data trends. Of course, every single homicide is one too many, and every single homicide more than last year is particularly frustrating to all of us. But let me also point out that last year, San Francisco had the lowest homicide rate in, I think it was 56 years. I would love to have my first year and every single year that I'm serving the people of San Francisco see homicide rates drop. I would love to see that happen. And I'm sad that it hasn't happened this year. But after a historic low, it is not particularly surprising to see crime rates start to trend back up a little bit, particularly if you look at what's happening around the country. What's happening in San Francisco with an increase in shootings and an increase in homicides is paralleled to big cities all over the country without regard to who the district attorney is, who the mayor is, who the police chief is. It is a trend that we see in the context of COVID, and it is a tragic trend, and it is one that we have to work hard to address. Now, I point out the big picture in the context, again, not to minimize in any way the irreparable harm of every single loss of life, but rather to address some of the fear that I know folks looking at that statistic and looking at some of the, I think, fear mongering that we are seeing from some folks on Twitter and on social media that is really unnecessary. Although every homicide is one too many, having a homicide rate that is consistent with the average over the last 5 years is not cause for increased fear. It is cause for us to continue redoubling our efforts to address those homicides and to start asking difficult questions about how we can do a better job preventing these crimes before they occur. Because let's be clear, my office can and does and will continue to prosecute homicides. But what we can never do in any homicide case, no matter how hard we try, no matter how hard we work, is bring back someone who has been killed. And this is something I look forward to working with Chief Scott on. It's something I look forward to working with all of you on. And let's be creative about how we can prevent these crimes from occurring in the first place. When they do occur, mark my words, we will continue to throw everything we've got at prosecuting them. Thank you.
DA, this is another question from the chat, and it's from Wendy. She says, it seems to me it would be helpful to have you and the police chief in the same room or Zoom room at the same time. Can you commit to doing that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Police Chief Scott and I talk on a regular basis. Just so you know, we have a regularly scheduled meeting. We had it earlier this week where we get on the phone. Pre-COVID, we got together for lunch on a regular basis. And I know that we'll continue to do it. But it's not just that. It's that my command team, my executive leadership team in my office, the chiefs of each criminal division, and all of my executive team meet on a regular basis with not only Chief Scott, but with all of his command staff as well in the police department. We are doing our best at the high levels to improve cooperation and communication, and we need some of that to trickle down to the frontline conduct and interactions that people like Will are having with officers who respond to reports of crime.
Nicole and Vikram wrote in with a series of questions, some of them related to previous questions that you've already answered. So we're sorry we can't get to them all since we're trying to get to as many different people's questions as possible. But one of their questions asks why open air drug dealing is allowed to continue in the city, given its effect on the community.
Thank you, Nicole and Vikram, for that question. It's a really important one, and it is one, of course, that we think a lot about and we hear a lot about from the community, particularly in the Tenderloin, but also Soma and Mission and so many other parts of San Francisco that are impacted in visible ways by open air drug use and drug selling. I'm particularly concerned about the really alarming increase in opioid overdoses that are resulting in fatalities in San Francisco and across the country. Again, this is not a problem limited to or unique to San Francisco or my administration. We are seeing opioid overdose fatalities surge all across the country. I think the New York Times, if I remember correctly, had a report on that issue maybe a week or two ago. And I think that trend, that nationwide trend, speaks to the need for treatment and harm reduction and safe consumption sites, in addition to whatever law enforcement tools we're deploying to address this issue. And here's another thing that I want to clarify, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what our office is or isn't doing when it comes to drug crimes. Here's the facts. Our office prosecutes the overwhelming majority of drug sales cases and possession for sales cases that the police bring us, but it is not working to solve the problem. So let me give you some numbers. When police bring us an arrest and an investigation in a drug sale or possession for sale case, we file new charges under my tenure in about 78% of those cases. And we take action of some kind, in addition to criminal charges, maybe a probation violation or a referral to another jurisdiction, in 84.3% of those cases that the police bring us. It's a number I know because it's a number that frustrates me to no end. We are doing everything we can, and it is not working. You don't need to go any further than the corner of Golden Gate and Hyde or Leavenworth. Walk down Golden Gate, walk down Turk Street. It is unacceptable. It is devastating to see that level of human suffering, and not just for the people suffering on the streets, but for the people who live in that amazing, vibrant, diverse community. The Tenderloin is the neighborhood in San Francisco with the most densely populated families with school-age children. And to have to walk through that human misery every day to and from school, to have to walk through that on the way to get groceries is absolutely disgraceful. And it reflects badly on all of us in this city. We need a change in strategy. Now, I've tried doing what I can. I've tried using the tools, the traditional tools available to prosecutors from the war on drugs. We are prosecuting the cases that the police bring us. It is not working for the same reasons that the war on drugs has failed across the country. Tough sentences do not deter people who are suffering from addiction, and they don't deter people who have no other way to make good amounts of money. We need to find ways to compete with and deter sellers, to interrupt the supply of drugs, and to get people who are buying drugs off of their addictions and into more productive environments and safe environments. On the law enforcement side, right, I don't have a budget or a mandate to build out treatment on demand, to build out safe consumption sites, or to do a lot of the other critical work to address the demand for drugs. The fact that we have so many people living in misery, so many people seeking to consume illegal and dangerous and potentially fatal drugs. We need the city and the Department of Public Health and other agencies to step up and make sure that we have the public health resources available on the supply side. On the demand side, when it comes to law enforcement efforts, I need the police department to bring me kilos, not crumbs. And all I am getting in that 84% of cases that we're filing charge in, all we are getting day after day, case after case from the police department is crumbs. We're getting a few pills. We're getting a few crack rocks. We're getting arrests that involve, in many instances, 18 separate officers involved in the case, and they bring us a few grams of illegal drugs. We cannot do anything to disrupt the supply chain, bringing large volumes of dangerous drugs into our communities if all we get is crumbs. I have begged the police department over and over again to start working with my team, to work with other law enforcement agencies across the Bay, to bring us real cases that actually change the accessibility of drugs in the Tenderloin. Until that happens, until the police start focusing on big suppliers instead of these tiny corner buy busts, we're not going to see a change in what's going on in the Tenderloin. Now, my office is working proactively to come up with better approaches so that we can do something different than simply replicate the failed war on drugs to address the underlying issues. We are active members of at least 2 different drug task forces, one led by Supervisor Haney and one convened by Hastings Law School, working to explore alternative approaches to these problems. And we welcome input and ideas and suggestions. What we cannot continue to do is repeat the same failed strategies of prior administrations across the country and expect to get a different result. So I'm begging the police department to please bring us kilos, not crumbs. And I am begging city officials in City Hall to make 24/7 treatment on demand a reality for people suffering from substance abuse. And I am begging our city leaders with access to the resources to do it, to create safe consumption sites so that our school children don't need to walk past injection drug use on their way to school. Thank you.
DA, this is another question from the chat. I don't have who it's from, but the question is the DA's office facing budget cuts, and how do you anticipate making these cuts?
Thank you for the question. Resources are always a limiting factor in any area of work. This year, it's been particularly frustrating for me. It's my first year. We made a lot of really ambitious promises and commitments to the city. We were off and running in my first couple months, and I was excited to try and fulfill as many of my commitments as possible in my first year. And then COVID hit us. And it hit the budget for the entire city. It hit the budget for every single department in this city. So the short answer is yes, we are facing budget cuts, and it is impacting our ability to do a lot of things that we want and need to be doing to better serve San Francisco and to better fulfill our obligations to survivors of crime and to communities impacted by crime. We could spend a lot of time talking about budget, but let me give you a couple highlights. First of all, our staffing level as approved in the formal budget that was passed through the mayor and the Board of Supervisors puts us back to 2015 staffing levels. So we've basically gone backwards 5 years in terms of what our office is officially on paper staffed to have. But in practice, our actual staffing levels are lower than that. Because when we have vacancies in our office, when someone retires or moves to another part of the country, as happens from time to time in an agency as big as mine, inevitably, we have to try to hire to replace those people. But even though their position is in our budget, even though the mayor and the board of supervisors signed off on their position being funded, when someone leaves, we are not being allowed to immediately replace them. We are seeing delays drag on, in some instances for months or longer, with vacancies that are, in some instances, in critical positions: domestic violence, homicide, other areas that are essential to our functioning. And so me and my team are doing everything we can to fill those holes, to plug those gaps. And it means moving people from one place to another more quickly than is fair to the attorneys or to the victims whose cases they're working on, or to the good functioning of our office. We need to be fully staffed. We need to have more resources for victim services in particular. We need to make sure that our core units like homicide and domestic violence are never allowed to have vacancies. And that in order to fill those vacancies, we don't need to decrease the staffing in other important units like our crime strategies unit or our general felonies unit. And that's unfortunately exactly what we're being forced to do right now.
DA, this is a question from Severin. My question for DA Boudin is about social justice. I think a lot of folks think social justice is about leveling the playing field for underserved, at-risk, mentally ill, and others who can't access proper legal representation. But isn't it also about equal justice, i.e. the wealthy and powerful not being held accountable or getting a much less punitive sentence than those who can't afford connected lawyers? What's your opinion and how will you address it going forward?
Severin, I appreciate your question. This is a really important issue, not just for me, but for the integrity of the entire criminal legal system. All of us want and need a system where the quality of justice you receive does not depend on the color of your skin, what neighborhood you live in, or how much money you have in your bank account. And sadly, all too often, the quality of justice administered in this country and in San Francisco does depend on those things. We do not want, and I do not want to be a leader in a criminal justice system that favors the wealthy. That is one of the reasons why the very first policy, first or second policy I put in place my first month in office, was prohibiting my assistant district attorneys from asking the court to impose money bail at arraignment. And here's why. Because money bail puts a price tag on freedom. And it also jeopardizes public safety by allowing people who are wealthy to buy their freedom, no matter how dangerous they may be, no matter how strong the evidence against them is. And at the same time, it violates our country's commitment to equal protection under law by putting those who are indigent in a position where they will languish behind bars, not because of their dangerousness, not because of the strength of evidence against them, but simply because of their poverty. That's unacceptable, and we won't stand for it on my watch. But it's not enough to end money bail. The inequities and the structural biases in favor of wealth and privilege run much deeper than money bail when it comes to our criminal legal system. It's why we have a robust white-collar crime division. And it's a division that I've been trying hard to staff up and to increase resources and support for that team so they can do a better job of prosecuting non-traditional cases, cases where the folks being prosecuted aren't all poor, Black, and brown, but look like all of us in San Francisco, a better, more accurate reflection of the diversity of our community and the diversity of crimes that affect public safety. It's also why we started an economic crimes against workers team. And I'm excited that the lawyer in that team leading that work has already, within his first month, which was back in June, I believe, filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against DoorDash because of DoorDash's refusal to treat its workers like employees and its refusal to play by the same rules as every other corporate employer in the state of California has to play by. It's an issue that affects public safety because we have workers being deprived of minimum healthcare standards, minimum wages, safe work conditions. And we also have a state a state workers' compensation fund, and other state funds that employers are supposed to and are required by law to pay into that aren't being paid into. Other companies are victims. The employees who are misclassified as independent contractors are victims, and all of us in the public are left holding the bill and paying for the healthcare issues and the unemployment insurance that is underfunded. So those are some areas where we've made progress to address your concerns, Severin, but I know we have a long, long way to go when it comes to ensuring that the quality of justice we administer is equitable and that it doesn't depend on wealth or privilege. And that's something I'm committed to working towards, and I know it's going to take every one of the 4 years of my first term.
Here's another chat question, DA. What kind of evidence is there that tough sentences won't work? If murder was treated like theft in regards to consequences, do you really think there would be less murders?
I don't think that treating murder like theft would be appropriate. And I hope that's not something that I've ever suggested to anyone. I certainly do not feel that way. I don't think I've ever said anything that would suggest that a murder is in any way equivalent to a theft. They are drastically different categories of crimes with drastically different implications for public safety and for victims. And I think they are appropriately categorized by California law as entirely different categories of crime. But to the heart of your question, there is very little empirical evidence to suggest that longer prison sentences in and of themselves decrease crime, or that harsher punishments, like say the death penalty, decreases crime. Let me give you a couple examples of what are perfect, if in some ways tragic, natural experiments with really severe punishment as a deterrent to crime. You can look at any number of states across the country that have, at some moments in their history, had the death penalty, and in other moments in their history, not had the death penalty. And you can compare violent crime rates, including the kinds of crimes that are specifically eligible for death sentences. And you can compare them from the periods with the death penalty and the periods without. And it's a very easy, simple, empirical experiment. And what you will see time and time and time again is that the use of the death penalty, its existence as a possible punishment, and its actual administration does not lead to decreased serious violent crime rates. It just doesn't. And there are lots of reasons for that. First and foremost, a really significant, if not the majority, of people who are on death row, who have been convicted of crimes and sentenced to death, suffer from very severe mental illness. Now, I'm not saying that as a legal excuse or justification, but if you expect a punishment to a severe punishment, whether it be a life prison sentence or the death penalty, to effectively deter crime, then you have to assume the people committing those crimes understand the laws, understand the possible consequences, and are behaving rationally in response to those possible punishments. And we know that people who commit death penalty eligible crimes are not behaving rationally in the vast majority of cases, if not all of the cases. So that's one problem with it. The other problem is we look at what happens in our state prison system. And this isn't unique to California. This is true across the country. People who come home from prison, whether it's California or New York or Texas or whichever system you look at, have recidivism rates in the neighborhood of 2/3. That means that within a couple of years of their release, the significant majority of people released from prison will be back in prison. So one argument is, well, people are irredeemable and we should keep them in longer. That's one argument. Let's lock them up and throw away the key, and let's assume the worst, and let's assume that people are not capable of change, and let's assume that we as a society lack the creativity or the tools to rehabilitate anyone. Now, the law doesn't allow us to send people to prison for life in most cases, even if we wanted to do it. So we have to recognize that 99% of people that get booked into a county jail, and there's about 10 million people a year in this country who are taken to a jail at some point in the course of a year, 99% of them will get released. They will not die behind bars. And so it's really important, if we care about breaking that cycle, if we care about ending this revolving door of recidivism, that we start looking at what is happening while people are in jail or while they're in prison. And what can we do other than simply warehouse people for longer and longer periods of time that will effectively intervene in ways that hold them accountable, that prioritize victims' healing and support with the resources we spend on punishment, and that ensure there won't be another victim of that same individual once they're released in the future.
This is a question from Todd. I see that you're part of a group of California prosecutors who are working on campaign finance reform. Could you please explain how it is that when law enforcement organizations donate, phone bank, lit drop, canvas, set up PACs, etc., for one candidate over another in a county district attorney race, it creates a conflict of interest? And give us an example how this might undermine public confidence in the justice system as a whole.
Sure. Well, Todd, I'm really excited about the Prosecutor Alliance of California, and it's a new group, and I think it's an important voice that's often been silenced in law enforcement communities. So I'm excited and proud to be part of that alliance, to be a founding member of that alliance. And one of the things that I had been working on even before we founded the Prosecutors Alliance of California was something that we call curing the conflict. And this is what your question is getting at. Most prosecutors, most elected DAs in California and across the country win their seat with financial and political backing from law enforcement unions in their jurisdiction. Now, law enforcement unions have a First Amendment right to spend money and be involved in the political process, just like every other union. Whether we like it or not, that is US Supreme Court law. So this is not an issue that has anything to do with trying to silence law enforcement unions. This is a question of how we as elected district attorneys or candidates for the office of elected district attorney can ensure the independence, the neutrality, and the public trust necessary to make difficult decisions about whether or not to prosecute officers involved in officer-involved shootings, involved in allegations of excessive force, when those officers are members of the same unions that got us elected. And so what I did, along with 3 other current and former elected district attorneys across the state of California, is I took a voluntary pledge never to accept direct campaign contributions or to solicit political support from law enforcement unions. And we urged the State Bar of California to adopt an ethical rule that would prohibit candidates for the office of district attorney from accepting those contributions. And I'm proud that I worked with other elected prosecutors and also Assembly Member Rob Bonta from the Bay Area, from East Bay, Alameda, and San Leandro, in that area, to sponsor legislation that would prohibit elected district attorneys from investigating or making charging decisions in officer use of force cases if the officer is a member of a union that supported that district attorney's election. And the whole motive here is really simple and really clear. The public has to be able to trust when we make a decision to prosecute or not to prosecute, that we are doing it because of the strength of the case, because of the facts and the law, not because of a relationship with the subject of that investigation's union.
DA, this is a question from the chat from Evan. And Evan wants to know, what is your office doing to revisit old cases where people were given unfair life sentences? Are cases being recalled and resentenced to lesser terms of imprisonment?
Evan, it's a really important issue. We have so much work to do looking forward. And of course, most of our work is forward looking. We're trying to make better policies, better practices, better charging decisions. But we also need to look backwards. We need to use today's standards, today's science to take a look at what we've done in the past and to ensure that we don't have people in prison who are innocent, for example, or that we don't have people in prison after 30 or 40 years who have served enough time given their role in the crime, who are safe to be released to spend their final years with their communities and their families. And so we have a lawyer working in partnership with a group at the USF Law School to identify cases where someone has served a substantial period of time in prison and where, based on all of the facts in the case, their prison record, their reentry plan, consultation with the victim or next of kin in the case, if we're able to get in contact with them, we think that the amount of time served is adequate. And in those instances, using a law called 1170D, Penal Code Section 1170D, our lawyers go in front of a judge, present the facts to the judge, and make a request for resentencing. And we have done that in a number of cases. I don't have the most up-to-date statistics for you, but it is something that we are actively working on. We're trying to review the cases of people in state prison out of San Francisco County and evaluate both their prison record and also the sentence that we would impose today, given today's sentencing standards and today's information about criminological trends and best practices. And so we are actively working on that process.
Thank you, DA. And then there is a question from Sean who says, I live in the Hunters Point community. Over the past year, we have seen an incredible rise in both violent crime and dangerous sideshow activity. He goes on to ask, how does the DA's office balance the community's need for social equity with its competing need for safety?
Sean, I'm sorry about the increase in violence and also sideshows. It's something I've heard a lot about from folks, not just in Hunters Point, but in other parts of the city as well. It's obviously an area where we need to do a better job, and we need to start by getting guns off the street. And I'm frustrated, as I know many of my counterparts across the state and across the country are, by the ways in which US Supreme Court precedent makes it really difficult for us to get guns off the street because of their interpretation of the Second Amendment. And we have a steady flow of really dangerous firearms into San Francisco, from Nevada, from Arizona, from other parts of the state. But your broader question about balance, Sean, is something that I think about every day and I try to balance constantly. I'll give you a good example of a place where I think we've hit the right balance and where we're working to do that in other areas. Bail reform. This is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. I think it was in response to Severin's question. We don't ask for money bail when we are arraigning a defendant in court for the first time, because no one should be incarcerated because of their poverty, no one. But when someone is a public safety risk or a flight risk, we will ask the court to detain them. And what that means is whether you are a billionaire or whether you are indigent without a dollar to your name, our decision about whether or not to ask the court to hold you in custody pending charges that you are by law presumed innocent of has nothing to do with your wealth. It has everything to do with public safety. And I think that's a place where we've found the right balance. We have a policy that prioritizes public safety and moves us closer to the promise of equal protection under the law. Now, there are other areas where we haven't found the perfect balance. And it's something that in many instances is a case-by-case, difficult, sometimes impossible decision for me to make. But one of the things that I remember as I make these decisions is that true lasting public safety is not achieved by endless incarceration. Incarceration can and often does play a role in our efforts to promote public safety, to hold people accountable, but we also need to ensure we're addressing root causes of crime. It's why I'm excited to work with so many community partners to ensure that while people are incarcerated in the jail, there's access to programming, there's access to reentry planning, and that when people are released from custody, they're not just dumped on the streets of Soma after hours, but instead have support and structure and appropriate levels of supervision to ensure that the next time we see them, it's because they have a job and are paying taxes and are contributing to their community, not because they're cycling back in to the criminal legal system. Now, I also want to be sure to address the specific issue you raised about sideshows. There's a local ordinance pending before the Board of Supervisors that would basically establish a city policy around speed contests, reckless driving, and other stunts with cars. That policy, if it's passed, I think it may have just been passed last week. I don't know for certain if it made it through the board, but if it did, one of the remedies that it would allow to law enforcement, besides traditional prosecution for reckless driving or evading police, is impounding of cars that are used. And hopefully that will serve as a powerful deterrent to people who engage in this kind of reckless behavior with vehicles.
DA, this will be our last question that we have time for this evening, and it's from Patrick in the chat. And he says, your office addressed and reduced the jail population effectively when the pandemic began to avoid a San Quentin situation. What is your office doing to reduce the jail population now in light of increasing fears of a surge in COVID cases, especially given Dr. Pratt's article in the SF Examiner this week and the increasing jail?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Patrick. The risk of a COVID outbreak in our jail has been very real since March, and it continues to be a very real risk. It's one I am acutely aware of, not only because I am in some very real, direct way responsible for every single person, not just in San Francisco, but particularly those who are incarcerated as a result of charges that my office filed. And so it is imperative that we ensure pretrial detention or short periods of incarceration not turn into a death sentence. We need to avoid that. We saw the very serious consequences when the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation failed to avoid that in San Quentin. We had dozens of people die. It could have been prevented. It could have been avoided. And it's not just the individuals who are incarcerated who are at risk. It's also every single person who goes into work in jails and prisons, our sheriff's deputies, our public health staff, and it's their communities, their families who they go home to. Many of the individuals who died of COVID from San Quentin died in San Francisco hospitals, competing for resources against people in our community who need those hospital beds, who need those doctors and those medical professionals to attend to their healthcare needs. So it's absolutely a critical issue for us, Patrick. And I received a letter from Dr. Pratt in advance of the article in the Examiner that you mentioned, as did other justice stakeholders, the sheriff and the courts and so on. And the letter made very clear that from a public health perspective, the current county jail levels, which are, as of this morning, around 770 people, are far too high for her to ensure safety in the context of COVID. I took her letter seriously. I try in this context, the context of a pandemic that has taken hundreds of thousands of American lives, that is taking nearly 1,000 new lives every single day across the country. I am trying my absolute best to listen to the advice and guidance of our public health officials. I wish that other elected officials around the country and our federal government had done that sooner. It would have saved lives. So Patrick, what are we doing? We're doing everything we can to systematically review the jail population on a daily basis to identify people who don't need to be incarcerated from a public safety standpoint, to do that difficult balancing act that the prior question, I think was Sean's question, asked about, where we balance public safety and the community's needs on the one hand against the increased risk to safety and health and life that COVID poses in the context of a crowded jail. And the other thing we're doing, and this is kind of in the weeds and technical, but I think it speaks to the broader efforts to collaborate between different agencies. A lot of our jail population review work that I mentioned a minute ago is in partnership with the public defender, with adult probation, with San Francisco pretrial diversion, and with other community organizations helping to find alternatives that can protect public safety and ensure adequate supervision and housing, while also helping us reduce our jail population. But just last week, we began implementing a new practice in partnership with the Sheriff's Department. And I just want to share it with you because it's an example of the ways in which we are being creative in the context of COVID to improve communication and making changes that probably should have been made years ago that will actually increase efficiency and justice. When police bring us a case, in those instances, let's take the burglary example. In those 20% or so of cases where we don't take some action on a burglary case the police present to us, when we decide there's not enough evidence, or a victim's unavailable or unwilling to cooperate, or there's some other reason why we are declining to charge the case, that person's usually sitting in the county jail. And traditionally, when we decide not to file a case, the first step is to notify the police that investigated the case, the police rebooking team or the investigating officer, and to have that team notify the sheriff who holds the keys to the county jail. Now, on weekends, especially holiday weekends, it means people who we've already decided we can't or won't prosecute sit in jail for an extra 2 or 3 days. And if you look at the numbers that are driving our jail population, it's mostly short periods of time. About, if I remember this statistic correctly, about 65% of people in our jail will be there for a week or less. And so identifying ways to expedite release of those individuals, let's be clear, if they are there for a week or less, it is not about public safety. It's about us processing their case through the bureaucracy, making decisions about what levels of supervision, if any, are appropriate or necessary. And if we can do that faster and more efficiently, we can have the same outcomes in terms of public safety, in terms of crimes that we prosecute. Because I want to be clear about another thing. Let me just, as lawyers do, drop a footnote here. When people get out of jail, it doesn't mean necessarily we're not prosecuting them. When I took office, we had about 5,000 open cases, and we had about 1,200 people in the county jail. The vast majority of cases that I inherited when I took office were being prosecuted against people who had been, at some point in the case, released from custody. That is normal. It's consistent with the presumption of innocence and the fundamental right to liberty. Pretrial incarceration is reserved for those people who present the most visible, clear public safety risk. So what we've done, back to your question, Patrick, is we've started communicating, as we should have years ago, directly with the sheriff's department. If we make a decision not to prosecute a particular case, we notify the sheriff's department directly. Now, we just started doing that last week, but it means instead of having the police department in the middle of the communication, we are now in direct communication with both of our primary law enforcement partners. It's going to help expedite release in those cases where someone was erroneously arrested or for whatever reason can't be charged with a crime. It's one little step, and I know we've got a lot more work to do, Patrick. Please send me ideas you have for other things we can do on this issue or other issues as well. I know we're a little over time. Arcelia, I don't know if we have any closing remarks, but thank you again for moderating and fielding all the questions.
Of course. Thank you, DA, for fielding the questions. And thanks so much, everyone, for this conversation. And we will see you next time. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to email districtattorney@sfgov.org.
I'll put that in the chat just to make sure folks have it.
Thank you, DA.
Thank you, Arcelia. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate you. Stay safe and have a good evening.